Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We're here in dockets number 2019-224E and 2019-225E. Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, IRP. Let's take roll. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioners Caston, Powers, Belzer, and Jay Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioners Thomas and Urban. We concluded the presentation of witnesses yesterday, and we have reached closing arguments. My understanding is that we should have 3 closing arguments from the company, the Clean Energy Interveners, and the Office of Regulatory Staff. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, this is Kate Mixon. I believe that CCBA and our client CCL et al. Will have separate statements, although mine will be very brief.
All right. So Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association, South Carolina Coastal Conservation League et al., Duke Companies, and Office of Regulatory Staff.
Vote Solar, Mr. Chairman, as well. Taylor Spear for Vote Solar.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Jeff Nelson for ORS. ORS will waive its closing argument today. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Nelson. So we're going to hear from the Duke Companies and Vote Solar and South Carolina Coastal Conservation League et al. And Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, this is Court Walsh for Johnson Development. Like Jeff Nelson from ORS, we're not going to have a closing argument or statement.
Thank you, sir. All right. So we will go in this order. Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association, South Carolina Coastal Conservation League et al., Vote Solar, Duke Companies. As you all may remember, I am limiting closing statements to 5 minutes. Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association, you're up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ben Snowden for CCBA. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, thank you for your time and for your attention. After enduring the last week, you may have the impression that there are huge differences among the parties and that it's CCBA's position that Duke's IRP contains nothing good. And that's not the case. We agree that Duke has done a very sophisticated analysis and that it's gotten a lot of things right. Many issues that are often contentious in IRP proceedings simply aren't in dispute, which is why you haven't heard about them. Commissioner Caston has correctly noted that the disputes boil down to a few key issues. Here are a few of the more impactful ones. First, the cost of solar. Duke assumes it can't get solar for less than the company can build it, even though its own competitive procurement experience shows otherwise. It's like going to buy a car and assuming that you're not going to pay anything less than sticker price, even though nobody else does, and you got a better deal last year. Second, the modeling of solar and storage. Everyone, including Duke's witnesses, agrees that solar and storage together provide more bang for the buck than either can on its own. Duke doesn't properly account for this diversity benefit, and so its model can't pick the right amount of solar and storage for the grid. Third, interconnection. Duke imposes an arbitrary limit on the amount of renewables that can be added to the grid each year. Because of this limit, the model can't even select new renewables for the next 5 years. It's important to note that it puts no such limits on the interconnection of its own gas resources. Finally, gas prices. Duke predicts the price of natural gas using private contracts that don't actually require Duke to purchase any natural gas. Not one other utility does this. Duke does it this way for the sole purpose of impacting avoided cost rates that are paid to PURPA projects. That has got no business driving its resource planning decisions. Now, these may seem like small issues, but they have a big impact because they keep lower cost renewables from being fairly evaluated in Duke's modeling. Now, here's something else that we do all agree on. Reliability is critical. Every single Duke customer needs to be confident that the lights are going to stay on and the heat's going to work even on those cold winter mornings. And that's going to require a mix of generation, natural gas, nuclear, renewables, even coal for some time to come. The key is maintaining reliability while minimizing risk and cost to ratepayers, because reliability is important, but so is affordability. It's a balance. Duke's proposed plan isn't balanced. Under their preferred portfolio, the model doesn't select a single megawatt of renewables beyond what it's already getting under existing programs, and only a token amount of additional battery storage. It's all new natural gas from here to the horizon. Now, that's not because renewables can't compete. It's because Duke's model doesn't let renewables compete fairly. Now, we are not asking you to tilt the balance all the way in the other direction. It is critical that you understand this. We are not asking you to force Duke to pick more solar or keep Duke from building gas resources if that's the best way to meet its customers' needs. We are certainly not trying to dismantle Duke's existing fleet. What we are asking you to do is direct Duke to revise its modeling with accurate inputs so that it can fairly evaluate the benefits of solar and storage to its system and fairly determine whether putting more of those resources on the system will save ratepayers money. If you were one of Duke's customers, and I know many of us, myself included, are, wouldn't you want to know if you could be getting cleaner energy at a lower cost? Now, Duke has questioned the motives of interveners and said that only it is a disinterested party. But the IRP statute does not reflect this view that Duke is disinterested. The statute requires this commission to conduct a searching review of Duke's proposed plan. CCEBA is a trade group, and we have our own goals, as Duke has pointed out. What are those goals? What we want is a chance to compete and compete fairly, because our members can only succeed if they can deliver energy to Duke's customers more cheaply than Duke can, and that benefits ratepayers. In closing, I want to reiterate that CCEBA agrees that Duke has prepared a very sophisticated IRP. They're a sophisticated company. They run their system well. In many respects, it's a very good IRP. But the standard set by Act 62 isn't good. The General Assembly has said that ratepayers deserve more than a good IRP. They deserve an IRP that represents the most reasonable and prudent means of meeting their needs over the coming years. Duke's IRP doesn't pass muster under Act 62 because it doesn't yet let you select the most reasonable and prudent plan. We believe that with the limited corrections we have laid out, it could. So we asked the Commission, as it did with Dominion, to direct Duke to prepare a modified IRP that addresses these shortcomings so that the Commission can determine, as required by Act 62, whether the proposed resource plan represents the most reasonable and prudent means of serving Duke's customers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney Snowden. South Carolina Coastal Conservation League et al.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. As I said earlier, I will be quite brief. At the start, I want to say that nobody here thinks that Duke needs to eliminate its gas plants or retire all of its coal today. As Mr. Snowden said, everybody wants to keep the lights on. But Duke's plans shortchange the role that demand-side management, energy efficiency resources, and resources like solar, wind, and storage could have to prevent the need for building new large gas plants in the future or retiring uneconomic coal plants earlier. Duke did not base its DSM-EE assumptions on the higher levels of efficiency savings that would have resulted if they had, among other issues, used the utility cost test to evaluate cost effectiveness in their market potential study. as was recommended by stakeholders and as the companies themselves expected to do in the near future. Duke also included higher than necessary planning reserve margins in their IRPs. And as Rachel Wilson's testimony shows, the evidence is strong that Duke can do a lot more to incorporate solar, battery storage, and demand side and energy efficiency resources, and do so reliably and cost effectively, keeping costs low and minimizing ratepayers' exposure to future risks regarding environmental regulations or fuel costs. John Wilson's testimony recommends a way that the utilities could secure needed resources through an all-source procurement approach that would further keep costs down. It claims that it's not required to choose one of the portfolios modeled in its plan, but that approach fails to acknowledge that the companies will be making decisions in the near term that will direct them toward one of those portfolios. Those near-term choices and how they meet the utility's long-term planning needs can and should be considered and vetted by the commission as part of this IRP proceeding. If those smaller choices are decided in multiple other dockets without relating back to how those fit into one larger long-term plan, then what is the point in having an IRP at all? Our clients appreciate the sophistication of Duke's IRP and the stakeholder engagement that they undertook. As Mr. Snowden alluded to, that process almost certainly made it so we had less to bring up to you, commissioners. We didn't focus on those uncontested matters, as that would have unnecessarily extended this already lengthy hearing. With that in mind, we raised the contested issues that we have because we think they are important, and that those shortcomings result in Duke's IRPs falling short of being the most reasonable and prudent means of meeting the utility's energy and capacity needs as required by Act 62. Thank you again for your time and consideration, and that concludes our closing remarks. Excuse me.
Thank you, Attorney Mixon. Vote Solar.
May it please the commission. Taylor Spear for Vote Solar. The evidence developed over the course of 7 days of hearing shows that the companies acknowledge three important facts. First, the utility's operations are subject to significant risks related to climate change and a net zero transition. Second, Act 62 charges the commission with regulating some of these risks within the IRP. And third, the companies failed to incorporate those risks into its resource planning. If the companies continue to ignore these risks, South Carolina ratepayers will be saddled with higher costs for decades. As to one, risk. The company's architect of resource planning, Witness Snyder, allowed that Duke Corporation's 2020 climate report is the corporation's acknowledgement that climate change risks have deep, substantial implications for the corporation's path forward. A response by the companies to a discovery request now in evidence further acknowledges that climate-related risks of all kinds may affect the company's generation fleet. Witness Snyder explicitly concedes the climate report represents Duke's acknowledgement that climate change may create stranded asset risks for the companies. These risks are both foreseeable and material to the companies and ratepayers. As to two, regulation. Act 62 requires the utility to demonstrate their plan is most reasonable and prudent. The commission's standard for prudency requires that the companies exercise, quote, due consideration to actual and foreseeable future conditions and risks, end quote. The company's witnesses do not deny that climate change risks are foreseeable, so they argue that these risks do not require due consideration. Paradoxically, however, their own testimony suggests the commission should not do the same. Witness Snyder agreed consumer affordability, least costs, and other foreseeable conditions referenced in Act 62, what he referred to as, quote, balancing considerations, end quote, are paramount for the company's discretion. Importantly, Mr. Snyder did not dispute these elements frame and are consistent with Vote Solar's very purpose in this proceeding, to ensure that the commission understands climate-related risks and evaluates the company's plans accordingly. Witness Snyder further linked Act 62 directly to Vote Solar's position when he agreed, quote, the commission has the authority to regulate risks that would be associated with a stranded asset, end quote. As to three, incorporation of climate risks in the IRPs. The companies do not dispute that they did not concern themselves with many of these issues. Witness Santillanti testified that the exclusive consideration of climate change in the proposed IRP is limited to inclusion of a carbon price and compliance with the North Carolina Energy Plan and the corporation's 2050 goal. But their analysis stops at the year 2035. Notwithstanding such a claim, discovery responses and evidence illuminate that the companies did not conduct an analysis into the incidence of climate risk to the company's assets, operations, and earnings, despite already admitting that climate-related physical, economic, and regulatory risks could impact the generation portfolio. Witness Santillanti testified that the North Carolina Utility Commission and the South Carolina Public Service Commission have, in previous IRP orders now in evidence, demonstrated their concern for the utilities meeting their 2050 goals. The companies, however, did not perform an analysis of whether the plans can achieve the corporation's 2050 goal beyond 2035. The company's arbitrary hard stop at 2035 is demonstrated graphically, if the commissioners would like to review it, in the IRP at figure 16B. The figure is missing 15 years of critical data and analysis. By assuming without analysis there will be no cost difference between pathways to 2050, the companies stick their head in the sand to foreseeable risks and conditions Act 62 mandates be considered. Now, this evidentiary foundation sets the stage for Witness Snyder taking Vote Solar's question to the commission during opening argument head on. Why does Duke incorporate climate change risk into their operations, but ignore them in generation planning? He testified the company's revenue is earned primarily from returns on new generation assets. The base case thus represents the company is continuing to do what it knows best and profits off most, building and owning generation. 10 gigawatts of new gas in the base case is certainly consistent with Mr. Snyder's self-description as, quote, old school, end quote. Vote Solar argues Act 62 codifies this sentiment out of generation planning and asks the commission to recognize what is best for the utility is often not best for ratepayers. In closing, as I did in my opening argument, I leave you with two words: path dependency. Mr. Fitch testified the commission should view insulating the company's assets from climate change risk as a marathon. Even though a marathon is long, we still start running on mile 1. Avoiding nearly $5 billion in carbon stranded assets costs to ratepayers requires that the commission take on Act 62's charge here and now in this proceeding. This is what Vote Solar asks the commission to do: reject the company's attempt to begin a marathon by walking. Path dependency demands that the commission reject the company's IRP and adopt Mr. Fitch's recommendations. Thank you kindly for your time and attention during this proceeding.
Thank you, Attorney Spear. Duke Companies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, and Commissioners. As the other parties have said, the Duke Companies, sincerely appreciate your time and attention and truly your interest in this case. I think we've had a lot of really interesting discussions over the past 10 days. As you've heard from Mr. Snowden and perhaps from Ms. Mixon as well, I don't think that any party has questioned the quality of the work that Duke has performed in leading up to its IRPs, the sophistication of the analysis, the robustness of the information that's provided, and also the effort that the company went to support transparency and provide a fair opportunity for everyone to review the company's work, and as we've coined this week, look under the hood. The 6 portfolios that the companies have put forward in its IRPs provide flexibility to address the challenges and the uncertainty that lie ahead, to provide our customers with reliable, affordable, and clean energy. And we just heard from Mr. Snowden, who claims that there is no new solar in what he called the company's preferred plan. But even that most conservative portfolio includes almost 9,000 megawatts of solar by the end of the 15-year planning period. 9,000 megawatts, that's a lot. And we've had some discussion about who stands to gain and who stands to lose in the commission's decision in this case. And Mr. Lucas, CCBA's witness, admitted from the stand that
Certainly the solar industry stands to potentially benefit if more solar and storage are selected in the IRP. And that makes sense, right? Why else would they participate in this long and grueling process if there wasn't something to potentially gain from it? The companies are required to do it by statute, but other parties are interested in this certainly for their own personal reasons. I think some of this bias comes clear through the clean energy advocates' failure to admit when asked whether any part of the company's IRP is reasonable and prudent. And I know we heard some of this from Mr. Snowden earlier, but from the witnesses on the stand, I have not heard that this week. And on the other hand, Duke has agreed to make a number of changes that have been recommended by interveners, and also adopt a number of recommendations through the stakeholder process. We certainly view this as a collaborative effort leading up to the product that's produced. So speaking of the intervener bias, I want to mention that the one entity that seems to be insulated from this criticism, if you will, is Kennedy Associates and the ORS. I don't think anyone's mentioned them yet today. And if we take a step back and examine what the Kennedy Associates have done here, I think it's very clear that they conducted a significant, robust review of every detail of the company's IRPs. When asked by Chairman Williams, I believe it was witness Collin who said that the Duke IRPs are unequivocally better than any of the IRPs from other utilities that this commission has evaluated, based on his 100, 150 IRPs that he's reviewed. Now, I don't raise this just because ORS and Kennedy Associates agreed with everything in the Duke's IRP. They had 26 specific findings in their direct testimony, and the companies have worked very hard to address every single one of them, even up until 8 o'clock last night, when we were working through the very last issue with Mr. Hyatt, I'm sorry, on the stand. And I believe we reached a good point with him where the companies have agreed to his recommendation to discuss this issue about a solar PPA model option, to discuss that with stakeholders and include that in the 2021 IRP update. And there seems to be an outstanding issue about when changes to the IRP should be made that Duke has agreed to. And I think it's important to remember that the IRP is not a static document, but it's a living, breathing, dynamic guidebook for how we plan to navigate the future. It's a forward-looking plan. And as such, it makes sense to incorporate these changes as we continue to move forward, as opposed to taking 12 steps back when we can continue on the forward path that we're on. And I'll just close very quickly by saying, as Commissioner Caston noted, that I don't think there's any end to the modeling that we could do. It is endless. We could come to you 2 years from now with 800-page IRPs for each company instead of 400-page IRPs. There's always something we can tinker with and look at differently. And we look forward to having those conversations with stakeholders in the future. We truly do. But the question here is if what the companies have done in this proceeding satisfies the criteria of Act 62 and is reasonable and prudent, the most reasonable and prudent plan. And I believe this is the only plan that the ORS has said is reasonable and prudent. Thank you for your attention, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. That concludes Duke's final statements.
All right. Thank you, parties, for your closing statements. A couple of things I want to highlight before we adjourn. First, I appreciate the lawyers for their professionalism. There are many attributes to define or highlight professionalism. I want to speak to the competency, honesty, and integrity and accountability of the attorneys. We've had some difficult issues here, but I find that all the lawyers demonstrated candor with the tribunal. We worked through those issues. We made rulings, and you all continued to try your cases. So I appreciate that. does not go unnoticed. I did not see anyone resort to unprofessional, unethical behavior, no name calling or anything of the like. So that does not go unnoticed, and you would think that that would be the natural state of affairs for the practice of law. But I'm sure all of you know that sometimes that does not always happen. So thank you for your professionalism. Also, I note that this proceeding took a significant amount of time, probably more time than we've spent in times past, but I think that has been highlighted by the fact that we have commissioners that are very interested in the testimony of the witnesses and the exhibits that are entered into the record. So it's just the nature of business these days. It reminds me of a 12-round prize fight where the fighters beat each other up for 12 rounds. Both of them are still standing, and the judges have to go to the cards to render a decision, and that's what we have to do. We have to go back and look at everything and render a decision after a tough fight, a very, very tough fight. So I just wanted to highlight those things. Is there anything before we adjourn? All right, we are adjourned. Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman.
was on mute.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. Ben Snowden for CCB here. I was double muted out of an abundance of caution. The current due date for proposed orders, I believe, in the Commission's procedural schedule is May 21st. It's our understanding that transcripts are not expected to be back until May 24th. Duke and CCBA, other environmental or clean energy interveners, would jointly request an extension of the due date for proposed orders till June 4th. We understand that the Commission's got a deadline, but we feel like that's would give the Commission enough time to decide. We've talked with ORS and other interveners, and everyone else consents to the request for extension.
Does anyone object to the request for an extension? The parties. All right, hearing none, the request is granted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, is there anything else? Several folks hit their mics. All right, if there's nothing else, we are adjourned.